Could a breakthrough on the battlefield using Ukraine's secret weapons system turn the tide of war in Donbas? On September 25, 2025, North Korea sent 87 tanks into Donbas under Russian coordination, supported by artillery spotters and Orlan-10 drones. The column included T-62 and T-72 tanks, BTR-80 carriers, and BMP-2 vehicles. Their goal was to break Ukrainian lines fast and hard. But the valley had already been prepared. Ukraine had mined every route, locked every coordinate, and linked targeting systems to British and French intelligence. HIMARS, Caesar, and FPV drones struck within seconds, turning the advance into chaos. But that was only the beginning. Ukraine deployed a weapon no one expected. Fast, silent, and fully autonomous. What exactly is this secret system, and how did it wipe out an entire armored force in less than an hour? At 3:12 a.m., satellite imagery confirmed the movement of a large armored column. A total of 87 North Korean tanks had been secretly transported into Russian territory and redeployed to eastern Ukraine. Under cover of darkness, the formation crossed the border and entered the Donbas region. Their headlights were dimmed. Russian artillery spotters and Orlan-10 drones hovered overhead, guiding the tanks through narrow rural roads. From a distance, it looked like a standard reinforcement operation, but on the ground, something was wrong. Villages were completely dark. No signs of civilian life. Windows were boarded up. Roads were empty. It was too quiet. The armored column moved in 3 lines. T-62s and T-72s led the way. Behind them were BTR-80 personnel carriers and BMP-2 infantry vehicles. All units were equipped with thermal sights and reactive armor, but none of that would matter. What North Korea and Russia did not know was that Ukraine had prepared this valley for weeks. Recon drones had mapped every curve. Special forces had marked every choke point. And now, British satellites and French SIGINT teams were tracking every move, feeding live data to Ukrainian fire control systems. The trap was set. At 3:21 a.m., the lead T-62 tank in the center column rolled over a buried anti-tank mine. The explosion sent a fireball 60 feet into the air, flipping the 82,000-pound vehicle onto its side and shredding its tracks. Seconds later, a second blast struck a BTR-80 troop carrier, blowing it apart and scattering debris and body parts across the frozen road. Chaos erupted immediately. Radio channels were filled with frantic shouting. Engines screamed as tanks tried to reverse, but more mines detonated. Ukraine had constructed overlapping mine corridors across all forward and rear movement lanes. Each zone was packed with PG-7VL warheads and 150mm artillery shells wired to pressure triggers. Explosions ripped through the valley in a chain reaction, igniting fuel containers and destroying multiple vehicles. The entire armored column came to a halt. Black smoke poured into the sky. The only light came from burning wrecks and the invisible beams of infrared targeting lasers from Ukrainian and Allied drones overhead. Ukrainian artillery teams positioned along elevated ridges had already calibrated fire zones. British AS-90 howitzers and French Caesar self-propelled guns waited for final confirmation. At 3:27 a.m., the Ukrainian commander issued the command, "Fire." The barrage began. Artillery shells launched from 18 miles away landed with deadly accuracy. The first salvos struck stationary command vehicles and fuel trucks, tearing through armored hulls and starting secondary detonations. The shockwaves echoed across the valley floor. Each 155 million shell created a crater 3 feet deep and scattered steel fragments up to 300 feet in all directions. Simultaneously, HIMARS rocket systems fired guided missiles into the center of the formation. Multiple T-72s were hit. One had its turret launched 40 feet upward. ammunition trucks erupted into fireballs. Overhead, Rafale jets from the French Air Force jammed radar systems and relayed real-time thermal imagery to Ukrainian fire control. Drones marked surviving tanks with infrared lasers. A second wave of artillery arrived 20 seconds later, targeting backup vehicles and escape paths. By 3:30 a.m., the temperature near burning vehicles exceeded 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel glowed orange. Smoke was visible from over 10 miles away. Ukrainian units executed their plan with precise coordination. FPV drones began their assault. Carrying thermobaric payloads, they dived onto exposed armor. One drone struck the rear of a T-72 setting off its ammo rack and blowing open the chassis. Another drone intercepted a retreating BMP-2 at the crest of a hill, destroying it on impact. French special forces confirmed secondary targets and called for direct fire support. British crews switched to airburst munitions, designed to explode 30 feet above ground and rain shrapnel onto vehicle crews. Electronic warfare teams from France and the UK jammed radio signals. Russian and North Korean units lost contact. Inside the vehicles, heat and confusion trapped crews. Movement was impossible. Escape was cut off. At 3:33 a.m., the shelling paused for seconds, only to resume again with another devastating barrage. The operation was underway, and it was only beginning. Before we continue, consider this. Russia claims that Ukraine's growing ties with NATO justify preemptive military action, but is launching a full-scale operation simply because the UK supports Ukraine enough to justify war. Is it right or wrong? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you agree, type Y. If you disagree, type N. Now, let us continue. By 3:40 a.m., the armored formation had been shredded. Dozens of vehicles were burning. At least 60% of the tanks had been destroyed. Their turrets ripped off, fuel cells ruptured, and ammunition still detonating. Smoke obscured visibility. Yet, not all vehicles were neutralized. Some T-72 and T-62 tanks still had functioning engines. A counterattack was forming. With no hope of retreat, North Korean commanders ordered the surviving units to push forward. Engines roared, treads crushed debris, turrets fired in every direction, blindly targeting the ridgelines. A breakout attempt had begun. The first group advanced up the narrow valley, using thick smoke and suppressive fire to create confusion. Coaxial machine guns fired into tree lines. Smoke rounds exploded to cover movement. Their only goal was to punch a hole through the encirclement. Ukrainian forces were ready. Anti-tank teams had been waiting silently behind the tree lines. As the enemy tanks pushed forward, they entered range. Ukrainian infantry used British-supplied NLAW launchers, French AT-4 variants, and shoulder-fired Javelin missiles. Each team worked in pairs, firing from covered positions and changing location quickly. One Javelin locked onto a T-62 as it tried to reverse direction. The warhead hit from above, piercing the thinner top armor and detonating the ammo rack. The vehicle exploded instantly, sending fire 40 feet into the air. A second missile, fired from only 100 yards away, struck a BMP-2's side armor. The blast shattered the vehicle, throwing debris in every direction. Despite heavy losses, other tanks continued forward. But the road was too narrow. Wreckage blocked passage. Tanks veered into frozen fields, only to find themselves stuck in mud or snow. UAVs circled above, feeding real-time coordinates to the artillery batteries. French Caesar guns and British AS-90s adjusted their aim, launching new salvos every 30 seconds. Precision airburst shells exploded 30 feet above ground, raining shrapnel onto the exposed hatches of advancing vehicles. In less than 4 minutes, the push collapsed. Only 6 tanks made it beyond the initial line of fire. 3 were quickly picked off by HIMARS rockets that struck with GPS accuracy. One missile impacted the rear of a T-72, its engine compartment igniting instantly. The tank lurched forward before halting, burning from the inside. Another missile slammed into a T-62 that had attempted to flee north. The impact lifted the vehicle off the ground. The remaining 3 tanks turned back, trying to find shelter behind burned-out wrecks. It was too late. Ukrainian forces pushed infantry units forward, backed by quadcopters and FPV drones. These drones dropped RKG-1600 grenades onto engine decks, penetrating engine blocks and starting internal fires. At 3:47 a.m., all forward momentum ceased. The counterattack was over. The armored formation had failed to break the trap. Burned-out hulls lined the valley. Bodies were scattered. Radios had gone silent. Command structures were broken. The few survivors who abandoned their vehicles were now exposed on foot. Drones tracked them. Sniper fire echoed from the ridges. No rescue came. The field was no longer a battlefield. It had become a graveyard. By 4:10 a.m., the battlefield had fallen silent. Over 60 armored vehicles were confirmed destroyed or disabled. The last engine sounds faded. Fires still flickered across the valley floor. The thick smoke that once masked tank movements now hung motionless in the cold morning air. Drone footage showed a long trail of wrecked equipment and stalled vehicles, but no further movement. The counterattack had failed. By 4:30 a.m., Ukrainian forces had secured the area and shifted their focus from combat to control. Instead of chasing retreating soldiers, Ukrainian infantry began searching for survivors and wounded. What followed was unexpected. Near a damaged barn, medics from a Ukrainian rapid response unit discovered 2 injured North Korean tank crewmen. One was severely burned, the other barely conscious. The medics treated them without hesitation. Bandages were applied. Water was given. One Ukrainian soldier shared his combat rations. Another used his own jacket to keep the wounded warm. At another location, a Russian crew emerged from an abandoned structure and surrendered. They were cold, unarmed, and visibly shaken. Ukrainian soldiers spoke calmly, telling them in Russian, "You are safe now. We will follow the rules." Captured soldiers were taken to designated areas where they received water, medical care, and food. Those able to walk were escorted. Those with injuries were carried on stretchers. There were no threats, no abuse, no revenge. Field tents were set up as temporary aid posts. Even simple things, hot tea, a warm blanket, a kind word made a difference. Footage from body-worn cameras later showed Ukrainian troops handing out bread and water to surrendered men, adjusting their gear for comfort, and giving clear instructions with respect. This conduct was not driven by publicity. Many of the Ukrainian soldiers had lost friends and comrades, but they followed military law and the principles they believed in. They knew the difference between fighting a war and losing their humanity. Commanders reminded troops that every action now mattered. The world was watching. But more importantly, their conscience was watching. By sunrise, the valley was quiet. Ukrainian engineers had begun clearing debris and checking for unexploded munitions. Behind the front line, medical teams were working non-stop not only on their own soldiers, but also on wounded prisoners. Logistics teams delivered extra food and water. Red Cross representatives were already on their way. The message was clear. Ukraine had defended its territory with strength, but it responded to surrender with dignity. This battle was not only a show of firepower, it was proof of discipline and humanity under extreme pressure. In the middle of war, compassion had not been lost. And in showing restraint and honor, Ukraine reminded the world that peace is built not only by winning, but by choosing not to hate. If you found this video valuable, hit like and subscribe so you won't miss our next in-depth battlefield analysis. This is Shield Military, where every strike has a story. See you on the next mission.